right, what's up, everybody? My name is Sean Vaughn, and welcome to the debut episode of Champions Material. Glad to be here. Glad to bring this idea to reality, man. Throughout this season and hopefully beyond, we'll dive into many different topics. We'll have thoughtful discussions with various guests, different ideas. We hope to make you laugh, hope to make you think, and everything in between. Now, for those who know me, and for all of you out there who will get to know me, for our debut topic, there was only one place to start: the sport of boxing. For many reasons, it's my favorite sport. It always has and always will mean a lot to me personally. We're going to dive into it: the business, the fighters, its importance in the world of sport and beyond, everything, the good and the bad. One thing I'll be doing throughout All Champions Material podcast, starting here, is to introduce the topics we'll be diving into up front. So as they're being discussed throughout the pod, it gives you, the listener, the opportunity to think, form your ideas and or perspective. And if there's questions, thoughts, feedback you want to submit, definitely feel free to shoot those over to me at champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Again, that's champions.materialsv@gmail.com. I'm here for it. It can only help grow this podcast and make it better. With that said, let's highlight the topics we're going to discuss and get into it. The golden era. What is boxing's best decade? 3 factors: the fights, the fighters, and their importance in the world of sport and beyond. Mount Rushmore. The top 4 fighters ever, pound for pound. Again, 3 factors: the era they fought in, the competition they faced, and what were they at their apex, at their absolute peak? What did we see from them at their very best in the ring? And finally, dream matchups. The top 3 all-time dream matchups. Pound for pound, regardless of weight class, at the peak of their powers, at the very best that they ever were. Example: what would a Roy Jones Jr. at middleweight do against Floyd Mayweather at lightweight? We're not talking about within the weight class. We're talking about dream matchups regardless of weight class, pound for pound. You with me? All right, cool. So let's get started. The golden era. What is boxing's best decade? Now, throughout the sport's history, we've seen some great fighters highlighted throughout the decades: Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, Henry Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, the greatest, Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, rest in peace, Oscar De La Hoya, Manny Pac-Man Pacquiao, and Floyd Money Mayweather, just to name a few. Now, my pick for boxing's best decade, and trust me, this was tough: the 1980s. And here's why. The 1980s, in my view, gave us the greatest set of champions and championship fights south of the heavyweight division we have ever seen. The great fighters of the 80s: Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hitman Hearns, and Roberto Duran, the Hands of Stone. They all fought each other at one time or another, and almost all the fights were great fights with the fighters being in their primes. That doesn't happen often. And not only did you see great fights with great fighters in their primes, you saw different types of fights, different ways to win. For example, Sugar Ray Leonard in his first fight with Roberto Duran. It was a slugfest. Roberto Duran goaded Sugar Ray Leonard into slugging and fighting his fight. And you saw heart from both fighters. You saw will and determination from both fighters. But you know what you also saw? Boxing ability. For example, with Sugar Ray Leonard against Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Understanding that when you box a slugger, it gives you a better chance to win. So it's not just will, but there's also skill and a strategy. And knowing how to use the ring, use the angles, think through a fight, and not just simply going and slug. So you saw great fights and different ways to fight and different ways to win. Arguably, the fight of the 1980s took place between Marvelous Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hitman Hearns. Anybody who watched that fight will tell you it's the greatest 8 minutes we have ever seen in the boxing ring because you had two great champions in their primes, each with a lot to lose, as much to gain, and they both decided either you're going to carry me out or I'm knocking out my opponent. Now, Marvelous Marvin Hagler proved to be the better man that day, but no one will ever forget what those two did. Again, great fights between great fighters and different ways to win, different ways to perfect the sweet science. Even today, I can go back and watch any one of those fights, and it feels like it just happened last week, last weekend. Great fights between great fighters, and they've all aged very well. Every one of those great champions can fight in today's era and dominate, all within the decade of the 1980s. Now, I know what you're thinking out there. I talked about boxing's best decade being the 1980s, and I haven't mentioned one particular fighter. Well, here he comes, Iron Mike Tyson. In my opinion, no other fighter, with the possible exception of Sonny Liston, was as intimidating, was as relentless, and determined to get you out of there as Iron Mike. This man would come to the ring with no robe, no socks. Hell, half the time, he didn't even have music. It didn't matter. He was coming in to destruct and destroy. You got in his ring as an opponent. You had to go. The Mike Tyson we saw in the 90s was a distracted Mike Tyson. He's had a lot of issues. The Mike Tyson we saw throughout the 80s, the custom model trained Mike Tyson, was as focused and as determined as any heavyweight we've ever seen. To this day, we have never seen a combination of hand speed and power in both hands as we saw in young Mike. He can get you out of there in the first round, second round, didn't matter. Think about this. We talked about one of the big factors in picking boxing's best decade was the importance of the fights within the sports realm and beyond. Non-boxing fans would host fight parties. And half the time you knew it was a good chance the fights might not even last 3 rounds, and it didn't matter. Because no matter what that man did when he came in the ring, it was always an event and it was always worth talking about. Iron Mike Tyson brought attention back to the heavyweight ranks that we hadn't seen since Muhammad Ali at his apex. Mike Tyson showed us when you're focused, you can come from any circumstance. And that man fought like he was determined to never go back to where he came from. I'm glad to see he's doing well now. He's been through a lot. But in the 1980s, when he was focused, when he was young, and when he was trained by the great Customato, few could have dealt with him. And no one got him out of there. The only person that eventually beat Mike Tyson was Mike Tyson. A great heavyweight, and beneath him, great fighters in their own right in the welterweight and middleweight weight classes. Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns, Roberto Duran. Great fights, multiple weight classes. All fights that mattered beyond just the sport of boxing. Brought attention back to the sport. A great decade. My pick for boxing's best decade, the 1980s. Let me know what you think. I'm interested to find out. Now, topic 2. Mount Rushmore. The top 4 fighters ever, pound for pound. Recap, 3 factors. The era they fought in, the competition they faced throughout their career, and what were they at their apex, at their very best? What do we see from them? Now, this was tough. I mean, earlier we did a quick recap of some great fighters throughout the decades in this sport's long history. So to narrow it down to four was very, very difficult. I've been in this game directly or indirectly for over 20 years, watching all time great fights either live or on film. Some great, great fighters. So to narrow it down to four was tough, but I'm confident that I've nailed it, that I've knocked this out. Now, before I get into my top four, pound for pound ever, greatest ever, special shout out to the man who just missed making my list, Roy Jones Jr. I will contend that to this day, there has never been a more athletically gifted fighter to ever step foot in the ring. Roy Jones, for the first 12, 13 years of his career, was practically untouchable. His athleticism and unorthodox boxing style was so great that it didn't even matter that he never quite mastered the fundamental aspect of the game, the technique, the technical side of the game. He didn't have to. We had never seen an athlete fight that way. Shooting left hooks without a jab behind it. Shooting right crosses from behind his back. He did things we had never seen before or since. For 15 years, especially when he was at middleweight and then transitioned to light heavyweight, it was an event if Roy Jones lost a round during a fight. It was only when he went all the way up to heavyweight and got a portion of the heavyweight belt in a great tactical fight against John Ruiz, and then came back down and losing 30 pounds of muscle in the process to fight Antonio Tarver, that we finally saw the athleticism wane, and he finally was able to be hit, and he wasn't quite the same after that. But that doesn't take anything away from how great of a fighter he was and what we saw from him at his best. Roy Jones Jr., honorable mention, had to get him in there. A great fighter. All right, with that out the way, let's go ahead and get into our top four greatest ever pound for pound fighters. Number four, Floyd Mayweather Jr., 50-0, 27 knockouts. There are two Floyd Mayweathers, in my opinion. There's Pretty Boy Floyd, and then there's Floyd Money Mayweather. Floyd Money Mayweather was one of the, if not the greatest defensive fighter I've ever seen. A great defensive fighter, sets traps, great counterpuncher, always went into a fight with a great game plan, no matter who he went against. You always had to fight Floyd's fight. He never fought your fight. He will counterpunch you to death. Nothing you can do about it. You can swing from any direction, both sides of the plate, your left or right hand. You never got to him. Think about it. In his entire career, how many times do we see Floyd really hurt? What, twice against Sugar Shane Mosley? Maybe in his first fight with Jose Luis Castillo? Maybe. And that's it in 50 fights. Money Mayweather was a great defensive fighter. And to give you an idea of how great this man was, Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather, which is who he fought as early in his career, was even greater. That was what I would call the Uncle Roger Floyd Mayweather, because he maintained the same great defensive ability, but he was also much more offensively aggressive as well. So either he could beat you up, or he can let you, as your opponent, beat yourself by being overly aggressive, and then he would just counterpunch you. We talked about what were these fighters at their very best, at their peak. The very best Floyd Mayweather I ever saw was against another great fighter in his own right, Diego Chico Corrales. Rest in peace. Look that fight up. Look that fight up. You'll see the complete package, offense, defense. power, aggressiveness, a game plan, never rattled. The best Floyd Mayweather I ever saw was against Diego Corrales. That performance alone might have put him in my top four. But then to go a 20-year career without a loss, 50-0 speaks for itself. Love him or hate him, 50-0 speaks for itself. He's done well for himself as a promoter now. He got out of the ring with his faculties. He got out of the ring with his finances. And he got out never truly tested. And that's greatness. The number one goal for every great fighter, every great champion, is to hit and not be hit. And few, if ever anyone, did it better than my number four, pound for pound, greatest ever, Floyd Mayweather. All right, we transition to my number three, pound for pound greatest, Sugar Ray Leonard. 36, 3-1, 25 knockouts. There is one primary reason why I give Sugar Ray Leonard the nod over Floyd Mayweather. And it was one of our three key factors in this topic. The competition that they faced in their career. Sugar Ray Leonard, as I alluded to earlier, fought in the greatest decade I believe boxing's ever produced. And I believe he faced the greatest competition as far as Hall of Fame all-time greats that boxing's ever had. Wilfred Benitez, Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns, Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Four of those five fighters I just mentioned might be four of the top 25 to 30 fighters to ever step foot in the ring. And Sugar Ray Leonard fought them all, and he beat them all. Another thing, it's one thing to just beat great competition. It's another thing to beat great competition in multiple ways. Look at his fight with Thomas Hitman Hearns, his ability to adjust and think within a fight. If you look that fight up, you'll see Ray Leonard begin as a boxer, but he also understood that against a tall, great jab, great right hand, Thomas Hearns, that he was not going to win that fight as a boxer. So mid-fight, his ability to think and change his game plan and to become a slugger, to get inside, to get to Thomas Hearns was the key. And he did. He eventually got to Thomas Hearns, and he eventually stopped the great Thomas Hearns to win. That's greatness. Look at his fights with Roberto Duran, particularly the first two fights. In the first fight, Sugar Ray Leonard allowed psychological warfare to affect him. Roberto Duran understood that if Sugar Ray boxed him, he could beat him. And Roberto Duran did everything he could to get into Sugar Ray Leonard's head, and it worked. He made Sugar Ray Leonard so upset that the Sugar Man was determined to knock Roberto Duran out. And he gave us a great performance in that fight, one of the best fights he's ever had. He showed heart, will, courage, and determination. He showed that he could stand in there with the best of them and give it back. But unfortunately, he lost because he fought his opponent's fight and not his fight. But then he came back. He reversed the psychological warfare. He made adjustments. And a few months later, it was his turn to get into his opponent's head. And that's exactly what he did to Roberto Duran. Got into his head, boxed him, humiliated him, to the point where the great Roberto Duran in the 8th round decided, I'm done. No mas. Get me out of here. Still one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen in the ring, especially from a great champion. Sugar Ray Leonard made Roberto Duran quit. It's adjusting between fights. It's understanding that it's a psychological game, not just a physical game. It's understanding, no, you're not going to get in my head, Roberto. This time I'm getting into your head. That was Ray Leonard. Look at his fight later in his career against Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Understanding you do not fight a man in Marvelous Marvin Hagler who had just shown in a great fight with Thomas Hitman Hearns, the greatest 8 minutes we've ever seen in a boxing ring. You do not slug that man and expect to win. Marvin Hagler arguably had the greatest chin in boxing history that I've ever seen. Sugar Ray Leonard knew I have to box him. I have to bide my time, and I have to fight a fight a certain way in order to win. And to do that against a world-class champion in Marvelous Marvin Hagler shows you how great Sugar Ray Leonard was. He's done well for himself outside of the ring. He's one of the examples of what boxing is supposed to do for those who perfect the craft, who put in the work. He's well financially. He has his faculties. If you look at Ray Leonard today in his 60s, he looks like he can weigh in for a fight coming up this Saturday. Great fighter. He's overcome adversity in and out of the ring. Now, we talked about what were they at their absolute peak. Look up Sugar Ray Leonard versus Davey Boy Green, right after he won his first title as a welterweight. That Ray Leonard that night was the greatest I've ever seen from him. At his peak, he had everything. He could box, he could punch, and he always had the ability to adapt and to win. Sugar Ray Leonard, my number 3 all time, pound for pound. Great fighter ever. Now, as we get to number 2, we're starting to nail it down now. Number 2. You know what? I'm not going to say it. I'll let him say it.
I'm young, I'm handsome, I'm fast, I'm pretty, and can't possibly be beat.
The greatest, Muhammad Ali. 56-5, 37 knockouts. There were 2 Muhammad Alis. There was the Muhammad Ali that fought in the 1960s, and that Muhammad Ali is undoubtedly the greatest heavyweight of all time. Period. Point blank. And that includes Mike Tyson, that includes Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, whoever you want to throw in there. The Muhammad Ali that fought in the 1960s. Speed, power, 6'3", 215. Can punch going forward, can punch going backwards, can punch going sideways. Unbelievable speed, unbelievable reflexes. You couldn't touch him. That man who spent his life wanting to be the heavyweight champion of the whole world, as he would say, also was a man who had principles that he would never compromise. Because at the very peak of his powers, at the very height of his career, he decided, I will not fight in the Vietnam War. I will not fight for a country who does not treat myself or my people equal. I will not fight for a country that persecutes my race and expects me to represent them while they persecute, in his view, another race through a war. Gave up at the very peak of his powers, gave up 3.5 years of what would have been his absolute prime, no question about it. And guess what? He came back. Did he come back as he was when he left? No. But I admire the second Muhammad Ali as much, if not more, than what we originally saw. Because that Ali showed us will when he no longer had the speed, when he no longer had the reflexes, when he was no longer untouchable. He could take a punch. He could think. He had a strategy against George Foreman. Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, Ernie Shavers. I just talked about Sugar Ray Leonard fighting in what I believe is the greatest decade because of the opponents and the types of fights he had. Muhammad Ali in the decade of the 1970s fought unquestionably the greatest era of heavyweights boxing has ever produced. Period, point blank. And much like Ray Leonard and much like Floyd Mayweather Jr., Muhammad Ali fought the best and he beat the best, all of them, in different ways. He allowed, keyword, allowed George Foreman to punch himself out in the rumble in the jungle. Psychological warfare got in his head. Is that all you got, Big George? George Foreman, furious, throwing everything he had. And Muhammad Ali, being the only heavyweight in that era who proved that he could take the very best of George Foreman, who was knocking everybody else out cold, including Ken Norton, including the great Joe Frazier. Muhammad Ali, the will to win. The legs weren't there anymore. The speed wasn't there anymore. But there was determination that you couldn't take from him. The same qualities that allowed him to stand up for his religious beliefs, regardless of what it cost him, showed up in the ring later in his career. Joe Frazier, the Thriller of Manila, the ability to outlast a great opponent in unbelievably tough circumstances. When Muhammad Ali said he's the greatest, who's going to argue? I know I won't. In and out of the ring, Muhammad Ali showed us that there was no one greater. What a fighter. And what a man. Muhammad Ali at his absolute peak. Look up this fight. It remains the greatest performance, not fight, performance I've ever seen in the boxing ring. Muhammad Ali versus Cleveland Williams, 1966. To this day, I train when I shadow box or sometimes spar to that fight. There has never been a heavyweight that can move like that can punch like that. He did everything that fight. It remains the greatest performance I've ever seen in a boxing ring. Point blank, period. Not fight, performance. There's a difference. Look it up. Muhammad Ali versus Cleveland Williams. You're welcome. Muhammad Ali, the greatest heavyweight of all time and the second greatest fighter, pound for pound, to ever live. Now, here we go. After the way I just talked about Muhammad Ali, and deservedly so, if there was anyone who was going to be ranked above him, it had to be someone who was truly, truly special. And there is absolutely no doubt that this man was that and then some. The number one pound for pound fighter of all time. The great, great Sugar Ray Robinson. 173 wins. I'm going to pause just for dramatic effect and let that settle in for a minute. All right. 173 wins, 19-6 with 109 knockouts. 109 knockouts. That's more than twice as many knockouts as active fighters have fights these days. In a 25-year career as a welterweight and a middleweight, at a time that you didn't have junior weight classes. So either you were going to fight at 147 as a welterweight or 160 as a middleweight. The man dominated both in 2 careers. Sugar Ray Robinson had 1 loss in his first 123 fights. 1 loss in his first 123 fights. And you want to know who that loss was to? An all-time great Hall of Fame Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta. You want to know something about that fight? That one loss in his first 123 fights to Jake LaMotta? Sugar Ray Robinson was so dominant as a welterweight, he would have to go up to the middleweight to fight bigger guys because otherwise it was a performance and it wasn't even a contest. Just for it to be some sense or semblance of competition, he often had to fight and still dominate almost all the time fighters who were outweighing him by 15 to 20 plus pounds every time he stepped in the ring. And after that one loss to Jake LaMotta, they fought 6 times total. Ray Robinson won the other 5 comfortably. And I'll highlight one of those 5 shortly. You know that I keep talking about the term pound for pound. That is a often used term within this game of boxing. You know why that term was invented? For Sugar Ray Robinson, man. In the 1940s, Joe Louis was dominating the heavyweight division unlike anyone we had seen up to that point. But beneath him, we saw the great Sugar Ray Robinson dominating the welterweight division in a way that no one had ever seen. He was so dominant, I'm talking about Ray Robinson, that when people were having discussions, when the newspaperman and the columnist and all the fight fans and fanatics were having conversations, they were saying, man, that Joe Louis is just, he's a king, man. He's a knockout king, but this Sugar Ray Robinson, but you know, if they fought, well, there's no way that Ray Robinson would stand up to Joe because Joe's got him by 50 pounds. Like he's a heavyweight. You know, the Sugar Man is a welterweight. How would he? Well, okay, so if they fought straight, but we know that Ray Robinson is better. We just don't know how. Oh, but what about pound for pound? Meaning, if they're not fighting at their weight, they were just fighting. If they were fighting the same style at an equal weight, what would happen? Pound for pound was a term that was made up to describe what we were seeing from Ray Robinson. That's how great he was. That term, pound for pound, has been used ever since to describe the fighter that we think is the best in this sport to this very day. So to this very day, some would say Terrence Crawford, Vasily Lomachenko, or for the past decade or so, you would say Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao, for example. That tagline, that phrase started in the 1940s with Sugar Ray Robinson. The great Sugar Ray Leonard went to Sugar Ray Robinson in the 1970s to ask permission to use sugar in his name. Respect. Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis, 2 of the top 3 fighters, or 5 at worst fighters of all time, regardless of whose list you pull out, have each been on record as saying that Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest fighter to ever step in the ring. Muhammad Ali has himself said, I say I'm the greatest heavyweight of all times. But if you're talking pound for pound, meaning I imagine if he was a heavyweight fighting the same style, well, we all know that Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest. Muhammad Ali borrowed the style of Sugar Ray Robinson because he wanted to prove that you can fight that style as a heavyweight. And of course, the great Ali acquitted himself well. If you want to have an idea of who Sugar Ray Robinson was, imagine Muhammad Ali at his best, faster with body punches, the ability to throw body punches, and that's Sugar Ray Robinson. When I talk to casual boxing fans, they'll mention Mike Tyson, they'll mention Muhammad Ali, they'll mention Manny Pacquiao. Some would nowadays mention Floyd Mayweather as the greatest fighter of all time. But anyone within the sport of boxing who really understands this game knows that since the mid-1940s, Sugar Ray Robinson has been the greatest fighter pound for pound to ever live, and it's not even close. One thing I would suggest, look up, it was a great documentary produced by HBO called Sugar Ray Robinson, The Bright Lights and Dark Shadows of a Champion. I highly recommend you look that up and check it out. It tells you everything you need to know about how great this man was. As the late great Ralph Wiley put it in that same documentary, there will never be anyone who fights that many times. There will never be anyone who wins that many times. And there will never be anyone who looks as good doing it. That's Sugar Ray Robinson. Now, we talk about what were they at their peak. One of the great tragedies within our sport is that in the 1940s, when he was at his absolute peak, Sugar Ray Robinson's fights were not filmed. You got highlights, you got clips, but you didn't see from start to finish. Imagine this. Let me put this in context. Imagine Jordan's 63 that he dropped against the Celtics in the Garden, or the shot over Craig Elo, or the spectacular move that he did against the Lakers when he was going for his first ring. Imagine if you just heard about those things, but there was not film of it. Imagine if those games weren't televised and recorded. That's how we feel within the sport of boxing when we have come to recognize that Ray Robinson's fights were not filmed from start to finish in the 1940s, when he was at his absolute peak, when he could knock you out with either hand, going forwards, going backwards, going from side to side, body punches with the left or upstairs, body punches with the right or upstairs. A great chin. He was never knocked out, ever knocked out in his 25-year career. The man had it all. Sugar Ray Robinson, the greatest fighter of all time. Point blank, period. One fight I would say, as I close out this topic, that I would encourage you all to look up is the sixth and final confrontation between Sugar Ray Robinson and the Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta. They call it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Massacre. Remember that word. Look up that fight and you'll see why it's called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. You'll see what Sugar Ray Robinson did to that man. You'll see a man, again, we talked about this with Floyd Mayweather and Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard. The ability to go into a fight with a great fight plan and execute it to perfection. You'll see Sugar Ray Robinson do just that against an all-time great, and what he was able to do in the late rounds because of his execution of his game plan. And when you're watching that fight, understand that you're seeing Sugar Ray Robinson probably at about 85 to 90% of what he was at his absolute best. And that will give you even more context as to why that man was the greatest fighter pound for pound to ever live. And my number one, Mount Rushmore, pound for pound, all-time great champion. All right. Now we're going to go to a favorite topic of mine. I've had this conversation more times than I can count, and it will never get old. It'll never get tired. It's the dream matchups. Okay, if you put that guy against that guy, what would happen? Oh, man, all time, if you put that guy against that guy. You know, I'm known as the boxing guy. People who know me, from the barbershops to barbecues to events, just hanging out. People love to indulge me with these conversations, and I'm here for it every time. So right here, I'm going to name my top 3 all-time dream matchups. Again, it's pound for pound. That word again, pound for pound. So regardless of weight class, what would these guys do when matched up against each other at the peak of their powers? Now, my number 3 all-time dream matchup would be Marvelous Marvin Hagler versus Roy Jones Jr. What would happen? You're talking about Roy Jones Jr., the most athletically gifted fighter I've ever seen, against Marvelous Marvin Hagler. An iron chin, iron will, unstoppable. If you want to know what Marvelous Marvin Hagler is all about, look up Hagler versus Hearns. You're welcome. That guy against the great Roy Jones Jr. Now, here's my take. Roy Jones Jr. could move, especially at middleweight, like few others. He would move, he would box, and he would score just enough points in a tough, brilliant fight to just barely outpoint Marvelous Marvin Hagler. But he would not come out of that ring undamaged. No fighter ever fought Marvelous Marvin Hagler and came out of the ring undamaged. It just didn't happen. That was Marvin. He was going to hurt you. Lost only 3 times in his career in 60 plus fights. There was a reason. 52 knockouts. There was a reason. He was going to beat you down, take your will from you, and get you out of there. And Roy Jones, with extraordinary, never before seen athleticism and unorthodox skills, would have used every trick in his toolbox, every trick in his bag to outpoint the great Marvelous Marvin Hagler in what would be a dream matchup of 2 contrasting styles and 2 guys that were the very best ever at what they did well. Man, I would have loved to have seen that. Roy Jones Jr. by split decision in a great, tough fight. My number 3 all-time dream matchup. Number 2, the Hands of Stone. Roberto Duran versus Manny Pac-Man Pacquiao. Roberto Duran, specifically at lightweight, is arguably a top 10 fighter of all time. They call him the Hands of Stone for a reason. His punches felt like you were getting hit by rocks. He was relentless. He was going to come after you, and there was nothing you can do about it. When he was on, watch out. But he was also deceptively great as a defensive fighter, the ability to stand in front of you and make you miss and counter. Conversely, we have Manny Pacquiao, another all-time great as a southpaw, who started out as a great power left-hand puncher and evolved to be a great boxer puncher. A guy that's got an iron chin in his own right, save for the 4th fight with Marquez, who caught him with a punch he didn't see coming. That can happen to anybody. Great boxing ability later in his career to go along with great power, great footwork, the ability to punch from different angles, to move at different angles. Who would win? I would have Roberto Duran stopping Manny Pacquiao round 10, round 11, from just the accumulation of punishment, the accumulation of pressure. Roberto Duran also had a great chin. And that would have served him well because Manny Pacquiao can punch just as hard as Roberto. But I think Roberto, all around, particularly as a defensive fighter, would have been just a little bit too much for Manny Pacquiao. But you want to talk about punches and action, you would have got that and so much more with these 2 because they come forward, they throw punches, and they don't ask questions. But they both also have deceptively good boxing skills and defense, particularly Duran. And I think he would have edged Manny Pacquiao and stopped him late. My number 2 all-time dream matchup, Roberto Duran versus Manny Pacquiao. Man, what a fight that would be. All right, here we go. My number 1 all-time dream matchup is the one that I've had the most conversation about. It will always be the matchup I will have the most conversations about when you talk about the dream matchups and who would win. Muhammad Ali versus Iron Mike Tyson. Now, we're talking about what they would do against each other in a dream matchup at their very best. The very best Mike Tyson was young, focused, custom auto trained, 1985 Mike Tyson. Peekaboo stance, deceptively fast, great defense, could punch with the left hand or the right hand, can give it to you downstairs or upstairs with the left hand or right hand against the Muhammad Ali of 1966. That same Ali that fought Cleveland Williams. 6'3", 215, long arms, unbelievable reflexes, can punch going forwards, can punch going backwards, had it all. Who would win? Who would win? My take, my pick, The greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. One thing about Mike Tyson we need to remember when we're watching all those exciting fights. They were over within the first two, three, sometimes 4 rounds. Mike Tyson eventually got to you. He got up under the long arms and the taller opponents that he often faced, and he stopped you with a punch. And then once you were able to stand, he got you to stand still, particularly against the ropes. He can dig to the body and then come upstairs with the uppercut with either hand. And once he did that, you were done. There were times where he could just lunge forward with a shot. If you were just casually moving back or you were not in defensive position, and it was one shot and you were done. I understand all of that. But again, I asked you, Mike Tyson, 5'10, shorter arms. Muhammad Ali, 6'3, longer arms. Could move for 15 rounds if he had to at his peak. Punch from any direction for 15 rounds when he had to at his peak. And let's not forget the psychological warfare. We heard the type of stuff that Muhammad Ali was saying to Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson, Ernie Terrell, George Foreman, and of course, most notably, Smoking Joe Frazier. Can you imagine the type of shit he would have been talking against a young, in his prime, Mike Tyson? Can you imagine what a prime, confident, cocky Muhammad Ali would have been saying, the type of things he would have been saying to Mike Tyson to get him out of his game? Mike Tyson would have been furious. He was already in the mindset to destruct and destroy. Add that to what Ali would have been saying to him, and Tyson would have been determined to get him out from the opening bell, point blank, period. And guess what? How does he get Muhammad Ali to stop? To land the body shot and then the uppercut. Muhammad Ali could move. He could move the entire fight if he had to. And he could punch while he was moving. So he would have given Mike Tyson something to think about as Mike would have been rushing him to get to him. How would he have gotten Ali to stop? The prime Ali, not the Ali that fought Frazier and Foreman after the 3.5 year out of the ring. We're talking about prime Ali. How does Tyson get that man to stop? And another thing that we need to discuss, another factor. We found out later in his career that we didn't find out when he was at his prime, that when necessary, Ali could take a hit. He had the heart, he had the courage, he could take a punch. And I would argue the very best that what he took from George Foreman and Joe Frazier was comparable. You can compare that to what he would have taken from Mike Tyson, and he still would have came back. Would Tyson have been able to hit him with an accumulation of punches often enough to get him to stop? I don't think so. But it would have been a great, great fight. I have Muhammad Ali winning by unanimous decision and talking a whole lot of trash while doing it. Again, he called himself the greatest, and in this fight, he would have been. But man, what a matchup. My number one all-time pound for pound dream matchup. Ali versus Tyson. As we wind down and get ready to wrap up, I got to say this. I love my sport. At the same time, I know my sport has had problems throughout its entire history. We don't always get the matchups we want when we want them due to politics, because of money, other factors. You know, speaking of money, I hate the number of fighters who have been taken advantage of financially throughout their careers, Mike Tyson being one of them. It's tough for me to follow some of the fighters after retirement and see that they're not doing well. They can't take care of themselves. Sometimes they can't remember their own fights. They're not able to, take care of themselves financially. I get all of that. At the same time, this sport has given so many opportunities to countless men and women who otherwise would not have had as many options to be greater than the circumstances that they came from, the background and the situations that they came from, to be able to take care of their families. This is a sport that builds character, confidence, and discipline. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience. Did I end up becoming a pro fighter? No, I did not. But boxing at an early age gave me confidence and a sense of self that I did not have before falling in love and becoming involved with the sport. It's taught me life lessons that I carry to this day. If you get knocked down, you got to get back up. You got to fight. You got to play it out. I'm not sure where I am today if I didn't learn those lessons from boxing back then. I still train and spar to this day. The gym I go to, we have great prospects, young men and women who come for different reasons because they just want to change the circumstances, either financially or they just want to feel better about themselves. They want to get in shape, not only shape physically, but mentally and emotionally. And I see it to this day. Now that's boxing. If not for the lessons I've learned in boxing, let me be real with you for a minute. If not for the lessons that I learned in boxing, I'm not sure if I'm doing this podcast. I had plenty of questions. I was questioning myself before I got into this game. I don't know what I'm doing. What if I fail? What if the audience doesn't connect with me and what I'm saying? What if what I'm thinking is not going to work? How do I do this? How do I do that? But then I thought about it. That was how I felt when I first started boxing. Never doubt yourself. Always be willing to bet on yourself. Always be willing to put it out there and live with whatever happens. That's my attitude with this podcast. That's my attitude with Champions Material. Another thing that boxing taught me, it's a life lesson. You don't do it alone. I didn't learn how to box alone. I didn't learn lessons from boxing by myself. It was people that were in my corner who were encouraging me to be my best, to be confident. Don't doubt myself. See where it can go. You have support. You don't have to do everything on your own. We're here for you. And that's the attitude I'm going to bring to Champions Material. I'm the one behind this mic right now talking. But for anyone who's going to take the time to support what we're doing here at Champions Material, support this podcast, this is our podcast. My thanks to you guys out there. Whatever happens with this thing, it won't be because of me. It'll be because of us. You taking the time to care. You taking the time to provide feedback so that this thing can get better and better. As the great Muhammad Ali would say, and I think this to this day is the shortest poem ever recorded. Me, we. Me, we. That's life. That's boxing. My first love and my greatest love. My thanks to you, the audience, for tuning in to our debut episode. I hope you got something informative, something positive you can take with you from this. And like I said at the top, shoot any feedback, any thoughts, anything over to champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Again, that's champions.materialsv@gmail.com. Also, you can check out our page on Facebook, Champions Material, also on Instagram. Soon we'll be coming to Twitter as well. We'll be back sooner than later with our next episode, The Replayables. Stay tuned. Until then, everyone out there, be safe. Hold it down. We're done.